Again, another silver etching by Paul Revere, depicting what we now know in American history as the Boston Massacre. What you see here is Revere's own interpretation of the events, which is, shall we say, slightly different from the actual facts. In it, the British are the aggressors, the colonists are the peaceful protesters, the British are the bullies who shoot and kill all these poor, nicely clad, gentlemanly colonials. The truth is somewhat different than what Revere shows you. There you see the town hall in which the Boston Massacre took place, right in front of that hall. See, Boston's grown up quite a bit around it, but the building's still there, part of the Patriot Trail in Boston. So now we come to what the social studies textbooks call the Boston Tea Party. And the events that surrounded the dumping of the tea on December the 16th, 1773. For a long time, the Boston Tea Party, first of all, was not called the Boston Tea Party. It was called the dumping of the tea, and people tried to forget about it for a long time after the Revolution. They found it to be, how would I put it, very, very... it would be very, very radical and a wanton destruction of property. Now, why did this event happen? In 1773, the East India Tea Company had gone bankrupt. And the East India Tea Company was a company that was so large and so multinational that it literally had its own currency and had its own flag, had its own army, and so forth. It was essentially a nation within a nation. And British Parliament said it's too big to fail. It would cause an economic crisis in Britain, because if it failed, then other things would fail. And so they granted the East India Tea Company a monopoly on tea, which bypassed the colonial merchants. That means you're bypassing John Hancock. And it renewed a tax of 3 cents per pound of tea. Now, this is not a new tax. It's not a tax out of nowhere. The tax always existed, and it was just a renewal. But following the Stamp Act and following the Boston Massacre, the reaction was quite typical. There was mob violence. Philadelphia, the mobs forced tea agents to resign their position. And in Boston, on December the 16th, Samuel Adams and John Hancock call a meeting at the Old South Church in Boston. 8,000 people show up, and in the middle of the night they go out to the ship, and they are dressed up like Mohawk Indians so that there could be plausible deniability. Who dumped the tea? Well, somebody that looked like an Indian. They knew exactly who was doing it, but they could say, with some truth under oath, well, the guy looked like a Mohawk Indian. And they dumped $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. Now, there's a couple of interesting things about this event. Number one, it's $1 million worth of tea. That is a serious amount of money back in those days. Number two, as Samuel Adams and John Hancock are on the gunwale of the ship throwing over the boxes of British tea, the bricks of tea as they were called, they were joined by men who were not of their social status, not of their social rank. And as a result of this, you see here the breakdown of social barriers. Number three, I had already mentioned on how it was an incident that was long forgotten until about the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and people started developing a love of American patriotism and a love of American civic religion, and you stood for the national anthem and so forth and so on, which, by the way, didn't exist until the 1930s. But one of the old revolutionaries who had been at the Boston Tea Party was there at the 50th anniversary. His name was George Roberts 12 Hughes. He was a shoemaker. And this shoemaker had stood side by side with John Hancock, the wealthiest man in all of Boston. And when these two men are doing the same thing next to each other, you're seeing a breakdown of social barriers. What happened in the aftermath of the Tea Party was, shall we say, almost a circus. Thomas Hutchinson's private correspondence, in which he had been essentially colluding with the British to impose law and order on the recalcitrant patriots, was revealed. And it made Hutchinson's life very tenuous in the colonies. And so Thomas Hutchinson, who created the Albany Plan of Union with Benjamin Franklin, now realized he could no longer stay in Massachusetts. He resigns his position as lieutenant governor, moves to England, and lives out the rest of his life writing a history of Massachusetts. By the way, the person that released that correspondence was Benjamin Franklin. After the Tea Party, John Adams committed himself firmly to independence and became the hardest working man for independence from that point onward. When word of what had been done reached the king and reached the prime minister, there was rage throughout all of England. Parliament convened in a special session and passed what were called the Coercive Acts. We call them the Intolerable Acts. The Coercive Acts were the hammer that was supposed to be brought down on the British, the North American colonists, especially the colonists of Massachusetts. They closed Boston Harbor and blockaded it, that you saw in that Silver Smith's Paul Revere. They transferred power out of the assembly to the royal governor. Essentially, they turned Massachusetts into a dictatorship. Royal officials who were charged with capital crimes were then tried in England, not in the colonies. And a new and more severe quartering act was passed so that British soldiers would be put into Boston homes to keep an eye on the colonists. Needless to say, in the typical British fashion, they went too far and managed to get Massachusetts, or people feeling sorry for Massachusetts, which many people didn't think was possible. Massachusetts now becomes helped by other colonies because while the colonies while Massachusetts is blockaded by sea, it's not blockaded by land, and so people start pouring supplies into Massachusetts. There are more pamphlets and writings and more calls for colonial unity. Person whom you see there is none other than Thomas Hutchinson himself, who was then forced into exile. He would go on and write a history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, considered one of the premier works of history. On the right is an etching showing a colonial woman in homespun. Notice, though, she is carrying a weapon. This is fast becoming America. There arises in England, then, a new prime minister, Frederick North, who is a man who's very much in tune with George III. He has, shall we say, an admiration for the colonists. He likes the colonists. But he knows that he's prime minister and he has a job to do. And he takes a very strong but tempered set of policies toward the colonies. And he immediately pushes through Parliament the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act allowed for Catholic emancipation. That means that Catholics in the province of Quebec would be allowed to vote, hold public office, serve on juries, have full civil rights. And it allowed the French Canadians to have their own language and culture. And it extended the border of Quebec to the Ohio River, which was the big kicker for the colonists, because that meant that the colonists would be further kept from getting into the Ohio Valley for a time, as British policy was still formulating. But the debt was rising among the colonists who needed to speculate on those lands and then sell them. Because of the Quebec Act, because of the growing financial crisis among many of the planters in Virginia, because of the rambunctiousness of the patriots in Massachusetts, the colonies call the First Continental Congress, held between September the 5th and October the 26th, 1774. Their first order of business or passage of resolutions for Parliament to repeal all acts toward the colonies, the Coercive Acts, the Supremacy Act that they had passed earlier, and that the boycotts would continue until, at which point, they felt that Parliament had eased off. They then say that we need to have what is essentially a convention in which British ministers and colonial ministers would all get together and decide once and for all what is the relationship of the colonies to Britain, and especially Parliament. Up steps Thomas Galloway of Pennsylvania, who then says that the old Albany Plan of Union that Thomas Hutchinson and Benjamin Franklin had proposed needs to be dusted off the shelf again. What we need to do is we need to form a colonial parliament, or better put, we'll call it a Congress. And this parliament would work in tandem with a president general who would be appointed by the crown to be the crown's chief minister in the colonial sphere. Many people begin to think about that. They're not ready to accept it, but they don't quite reject it either. John Adams steps up and says that before anything happens, Parliament needs to redress our grievances. They need to answer for what they've done to us. And if they don't, then we'll have to maybe find other less peaceful ways of asserting our rights within the British Empire. And John Adams is not the most extreme, because now you have conventions being called in counties throughout the colonies, such as in Suffolk, Massachusetts, which tells the colonists, start stocking your weapons. Get every rifle you can. Every extra one goes into a storage facility, an armory, an arsenal, and keep your own and keep your powder dry. So you're starting to see a call for arms. This picture that you see here shows how Parliament, that is represented by the Scottish fellow in the kilt wielding the sword, is killing the goose that lays the golden eggs, as the king in the blue coat and his ministers, picking their noses and so forth, are looking on idly, and the dog even is taking a whiz on the colonies.